The water was scalding, just shy of blistering, and I kept my hands buried in it like penance. Grease clung to my forearms, eggshell fragments swirled in the suds, and the industrial dishwasher behind me groaned like a tired animal. It was Tuesday. Always Tuesday. That was the day the lunch rush bled into the dinner prep, and Lou never scheduled enough help. Not that I minded. The rhythm of scrubbing, rinsing, stacking, it was mindless. And right then, mindlessness was mercy. I just scraped the last of a charred omelet off a cast iron skillet when I heard it. A soft, deliberate asterisk thwip against the stainless steel-tipped jar we kept by the mop bucket. Not the usual crinkle of a dollar bill or the rattle of loose change. This was crisp, thick. I turned, towel already halfway to my wet hands, and there he was, standing just inside the kitchen's swinging door, impossibly out of place, was a man in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Silver hair swept back, posture straight, but not stiff, eyes scanning the chaos of the kitchen with a quiet intensity. And then he looked at me. Not through me, like customers usually did, like I was part of the dishwasher's hum or the clatter of pans, but at asterisk me, like he'd been searching. He didn't smile, didn't flinch at the smell of fryer oil or the puddle of soapy water near his polished shoes. He just nodded slightly and said, voice low but clear over the kitchen din, "What's your name, child?" My breath caught. Not because of the question, people asked it all the time, but because of the way he said it. Like it mattered. Like he already suspected the answer and was bracing for it. I wiped my hands slowly, buying time. "Aliner," I said, "just the first name. No last name. No extra syllables." I'd learned early that names could be invitations. He didn't react at first. Just held my gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, his throat tightened. His fingers twitched at his side, like he wanted to reach for something or someone. Without another word, he turned and pushed back through the swinging door. I thought that was it, another strange moment in a string of them. But then I heard Lou's voice from the front. "Holy, sir, you don't gotta." Curious, I walked to the pass-through window. On the counter sat the diner's battered tip jar, and sticking straight out of it, like a flag planted on foreign soil, was a single $500 bill. Lou was staring at it like it might explode. He just left it, asked for your name, then walked out. I didn't touch it, didn't even lean closer, because in that moment, I knew. I didn't have proof, not yet, but something in the set of that man's shoulders, the precision of his coat, the way his eyes held mine like he was seeing a ghost. It all clicked into a memory I'd buried with my mother. He hadn't come to tip a waitress. He'd come to find a granddaughter. And the worst part, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to succeed. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even when I got home that night, peeled off my soaked uniform, and stood under a shower, so hot it turned my skin pink. Because crying would have meant it mattered, and I wasn't ready to admit that it did. but sitting on the edge of my mattress later, still wrapped in a towel, I stared at the cracked screen of my phone and thought about every time someone had looked at me and seen only what I was doing, never who I was. The professor who assumed I'd drop out because I worked nights. The landlord who raised my rent after seeing my diner apron in the hallway. Even my own cousin at my mother's funeral, whispering, "She always said you'd end up just like her, barely getting by." They weren't wrong about the getting by part, but they missed the rest. The part where I stayed up until 2 a.m. rewriting essays after closing shift. The part where I skipped meals so I could pay for my mother's final hospice copay. The part where I kept her journals in a shoebox under my bed, rereading her favorite line like a prayer. Dignity isn't given. It's claimed quietly, every single day. That man in the overcoat, he didn't know any of that. All he knew was a name and a face that looked too much like his own. And yet, he tipped $500, not $20 with a wink, not $100 to impress. $500 left like a down payment on a relationship he'd forfeited decades ago. If you've ever been told you're too proud for refusing help that comes wrapped in strings, if you've ever been called ungrateful for demanding respect before you accept a handout, if you've stood in a room full of people who only notice you when they need something cleaned, cooked, or carried, then you know this ache. It's not anger. It's exhaustion. The kind that settles in your bones when you're constantly proving your worth to people who never had to prove theirs. So before you scroll past this story thinking it's just another rich grandpa redemption arc, consider this. I'm not telling it because I got rescued. I'm telling it because I almost let them convince me I needed saving. And if that's you, if you're holding your breath in some version of Lou's Diner right now, waiting for someone to finally see you, drop a droplet in the comments. Not for pity, not for drama, but as a quiet signal, I'm still here. I'm still claiming my dignity, because sometimes the first witness to your truth is you. Lou's Diner wasn't just a place I worked. It was the skin I wore when the world refused to see me whole. Every morning at 5:15 a.m., I'd push through that chipped green door beneath the flickering neon open sign, the bell above jangling like a tired sigh. Inside, the air hung thick with the ghosts of 1,000 breakfasts, burnt coffee, bacon fat, syrup that never quite rinsed off the countertops. The vinyl booths were cracked in the same places year after year, patched with duct tape that matched nothing and held everything together. It was ugly. It was honest. And for 3 years, it had been my sanctuary and my sentence. I knew every sound by heart. The hiss of the griddle heating up, the clack of the old register when Lou rang up a short stack, the low murmur of truckers swapping stories in booth 6. I knew which plates chipped easiest, the blue-rimmed ones, which coffee mugs held heat longest, the chipped white one with world's best dad faded nearly gone, and which customers left tips folded neatly under their napkins versus tossed carelessly beside their empty water glasses. I knew because noticing was how I stayed invisible in plain sight. How I moved through the space without taking up room, even when my feet throbbed and my shoulders ached from lifting trays stacked too high. Outside, people drove past Lou's without a second glance. To them, it was just another greasy spoon on the edge of town, a place for hungover college kids or night shift workers grabbing a slice of pie before dawn. They didn't see the retired schoolteacher who came in every Thursday just to talk to me about my sociology readings. They didn't see the single mom who saved her tips in a mason jar, labeled Keisha's college fund. They certainly didn't see me, the girl wiping down tables with a rag that never quite got clean, as someone with a future beyond these walls. But behind the counter, in the quiet lull between rushes, I'd let myself imagine. I'd sketch floor plans for a community center on napkins, jot down scholarship deadlines in the margins of order pads, rehearse interview answers while scrubbing the fryer basket. My dreams didn't have soundtracks or sweeping camera pans. They had grease stains and bus schedules. And they were mine alone. The motif of buttons had followed me here without my noticing at first. My uniform shirt was missing its third button, the one right over my heart. And I'd never replaced it because sewing felt like admitting I'd be here long enough to care. The diner's call bell, mounted near the kitchen pass, had a chipped red button that stuck sometimes, so you had to press it twice to get service. And then there was that man's coat, tailored, expensive, with mother-of-pearl buttons that caught the fluorescent light like tiny moons. He hadn't touched it when he stood in my kitchen, hadn't fidgeted, hadn't needed to. His buttons were secure, his place in the world unquestioned. But mine, my buttons were loose. My name was a question. My worth was conditional on how fast I could refill coffee or how politely I could smile when someone called me honey. The surface was all warmth and pancakes. The substance, it was exhaustion wrapped in dignity, served on a chipped plate with a side of silence. And that's why, when he walked in, not as a customer, but as someone who recognized something beneath the apron, I didn't just feel seen. I felt exposed, because once you're truly seen, you can't go back to being invisible. And I wasn't sure I was ready to be known. My mother never talked about him, not really. Not in the way people talk about absent fathers or estranged parents. She didn't curse his name over burnt toast or sob into pillowcases on holidays. She just folded that part of her life away like a letter she'd decided never to mail. But I saw the ghost of him in the way she'd pause sometimes when a certain jazz standard played on the radio, the one with the muted trumpet and slow, aching chords. I saw it in the way she'd stiffen if someone mentioned old money or private schools or summer homes on the coast. And I saw it most clearly in the locked cedar box she kept on the highest shelf of her closet, the one she told me not to open until you're ready to carry more than you've got room for. She raised me in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat where the walls vibrated with every spin cycle. Her hands were always chapped from disinfectant and dishwater. Her hair, usually pulled back in a fraying elastic. Her shoes scuffed at the toes from walking to 3 different clients' houses each day. She was a home health aide, worked with elderly patients who couldn't remember their own grandchildren's names, but always remembered to thank her. And she never complained. Not once. Not even when the bus broke down in the rain, and she had to walk 6 miles to make her shift. Not even when her back gave out, and she cried silently in the bathroom, so I wouldn't hear. She worked double shifts for years, not because she loved the work, but because it was honest. Money with strings, she'd say, isn't money, it's a leash. She learned that the hard way. At 19, she'd fallen for a mechanic with kind eyes and oil-stained hands. Her father, the man in the overcoat, called it a disgrace. Said she was throwing away a legacy for grease and gravity. When she refused to end it, he cut her off. No warning, no conversation. Just a certified letter revoking her trust, fund access, and a cold note. You've chosen your path. Walk it alone. She did. For 25 years, she walked it alone except for me. And when she got sick, she did that alone too, at first. Hid the diagnosis for months because she didn't want me to drop out of community college to care for her. By the time I found out, the cancer had spread. I moved her into my studio apartment, turned my desk into a medicine station, and picked up extra shifts at Lou's just to cover the copays insurance wouldn't touch. She fought until the end, but her last days were haunted by something quieter than pain, regret. Not for leaving him, but for letting his silence define her worth. The night she died, she pressed that cedar box into my hands. Her voice was thin, like paper tearing. If he ever finds you, she whispered, don't trust his money. Trust your name. You're a leaner rose, not his heir, not his redemption. Just you. Then she closed her eyes, and I was alone. When he walked into the diner, I wasn't just a waitress. I was the daughter of a woman who'd been erased for loving the wrong man. I was the granddaughter of someone who valued legacy over love. And I was standing in a kitchen that smelled of burnt eggs and second-hand hope, wondering if history was about to repeat itself, or if I finally had the receipts to rewrite it. Because this time, I wasn't just carrying my mother's grief. I was holding her warning, and I wasn't about to let it go. 2 weeks after the $500 bill, and that haunting question, what's your name, child? I was elbow deep in overdue textbooks when my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar landline. The voice on the other end was soft but firm, laced with the kind of warmth that only comes from someone who's seen decades of heartbreak and still chooses kindness. Eleanor, dear, Mrs. Delaney said, you need to come by. I've got something that belongs to you. I almost didn't go. Suspicion had become my second skin. Too many people had something for me that turned out to be pity, pressure, or paperwork designed to bind me to someone else's narrative. But Mrs. Delaney wasn't just anyone. She lived across the hall from my mom for 15 years, had brought us soup when I had pneumonia, watered our sad little ficus when Mom worked weekends, and once held my hair back when I got food poisoning from a bad taco truck. She'd been there when no one else showed up, so I went. Her sunroom smelled of lavender and old paper. Lace curtains filtered the afternoon light, and a calico cat dozed on a crocheted pillow in the corner. She didn't greet me with small talk, just handed me a yellowed envelope sealed with red wax, cracked but intact, and said, "He came to me last week. Looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. Said he'd been searching for you since your mother's obituary ran in the Herald. Said he didn't know your middle name until now." My hands trembled as I turned the envelope over. It wasn't addressed to me. It was labeled simply, "For Alina Rose when she's ready." Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored stationery. Not a check, not a contract, just a letter from my mother, dated 2009, written in her looping cursive, the ink slightly blurred in one corner like she'd been crying. "To whoever finds this, my daughter is Alina Rose, born June 12, 1998, at St. Mary's Hospital. She has my eyes, but her grandfather's stubbornness. If you're reading this, it means he's finally asking. Tell him I never stopped loving him, but I refused to let him teach her that love has conditions." I couldn't speak. Tears blurred the words, but I didn't wipe them away. Because this wasn't just proof I existed in his world. It was proof my mother had planned for this moment. She'd known he might come back, and she'd left a trail not for him, but for me. Mrs. Delaney placed a gentle hand on my wrist. Her skin was paper-thin, veins like blue rivers under the surface, but her grip was steady. "He didn't know about this letter," she said quietly. "I kept it safe all these years, just like she asked. But when he showed up, gray-haired, trembling, asking if I'd ever seen a girl who looked like Clara, I knew it was time." She paused, then added, "He didn't beg, didn't offer money, just asked if you were well, if you were happy." I looked up, stunned. "He asked if I was happy." She nodded. "And when I told him you worked 2 jobs and studied late into the night, he sat right there," she pointed to the wicker chair by the window, "and didn't say a word for 10 minutes. Then he left this." She slid a small notarized affidavit across the table. It bore his signature, witnessed and stamped, stating under penalty of perjury that he acknowledged Alina Rose as his biological granddaughter and expressed profound regret for his absence. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a record, a legal witnessed admission that I wasn't a rumor or a rumor's daughter. I was real. And for the first time since he walked into Lou's diner, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not trust, but validation. Because this elderly woman, this quiet ally, who'd watched my mother endure silence for decades, hadn't just kept a secret. She preserved a truth. And now she was handing it back to me, sealed not with wax, but with loyalty. In that sun-dappled room, surrounded by the scent of memory and the weight of legacy, I finally understood. I wasn't alone in remembering, and I never had been. I kept the affidavit and my mother's letter in a manila folder under my mattress, the same place I stored my transcripts, my lease, and the faded photo of Mom and me at the county fair. her arm slung proudly around my shoulders despite the hole in her sweater. For days, I didn't touch the folder. Just knowing it was there was enough. But curiosity, that quiet predator, eventually gnawed through my caution. At the public library where the Wi-Fi was slow, but the privacy was free, I sat in a carrel tucked between the genealogy microfiche machines and the community bulletin board. The librarian, Mr. Chen, gave me a small nod as I passed. He'd seen me here for years, always researching something. Scholarship forms, tenant rights, once even the chemical composition of dish soap for a chemistry assignment, not paranoia. He didn't ask questions. That's why I loved this place. Here, I wasn't the diner girl. I was just a person with a question and a library card. I started with public records, birth announcements, obituaries, property registries. And then, because I needed to see it with my own eyes, I pulled up the digital archive of the Havenbrook Herald, June 1998. There it was, nestled between a report on the town's new traffic lights and a coupon for Bob's Hardware. Clara Winthrop welcomes daughter, Alina Rose. Below it, a tiny black and white photo mom, exhausted but radiant, holding a swaddled bundle. And in the caption, proud grandfather, Alistair Winthrop, was unable to attend due to business obligations. The lie of it made my stomach twist. He hadn't been unable. He'd chosen not to come, chosen not to call, chosen silence over his own blood. But then I scrolled further past my birth, past Mom's obituary, and found something else. A small notice from 2000. A quiet legal filing. A minor trust account opened in the name of Alina Rose Winthrop, funded with an initial deposit of $25,000, held in escrow until age 25. No withdrawals. No activity. Just waiting. I printed it. My hands shook as the paper slid from the machine, still warm. That afternoon, I went back to the diner not to work, but to think. I sat in booth 4, the one farthest from the door, and laid out what I had, the library printout, the notarized affidavit, and a grainy photocopy of the birth announcement. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't a hug, but it was a trail. A paper trail built not in weeks, but in years, spanning my entire life. When I finally showed these to him weeks later, during a carefully worded coffee meetup at a neutral cafe, he didn't flinch, didn't spin, just nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this reckoning. I tried, he said, voice low. After Clara cut contact, I opened that account, sent letters through her lawyer. They were all returned unopened. I didn't know she'd moved. Didn't know about your school, your life. He trailed off, then added, almost to himself. I tracked the diner through your employee ID photo on their website. Saw your name listed under kitchen staff. It was the first real lead in 20 years. I almost believed him. Almost. Because the receipts were real. The trust account existed. The letters, verified later through his attorney, had indeed been returned, stamped, addressee unknown. The birth announcement was public record. The affidavit was notarized. And yet, none of it erased the decades of absence. None of it brought my mother back to see him try. Still, I couldn't dismiss it as manipulation. This wasn't the sloppy guilt of a last-minute apology. This was meticulous, deliberate, painstaking, like a man who'd spent years trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and had finally found one with my name on it. But here's what they don't tell you about receipts. They can prove someone was there. They can prove someone tried. But they can't prove someone cared. Not unless the caring shows up in real time. Not just in paper. So I tucked the folder away again. Not as proof of love, but as proof that the truth was more complicated than I'd let myself believe. And that complication was the first crack in my armor. He invited me to lunch at the Regent, a place I'd only ever seen through the tinted windows of passing town cars. White tablecloths, crystal water goblets, a hostess who looked at my thrift store blazer like it had committed a crime. I'd worn jeans on purpose, not to be defiant, but to be clear. I wasn't stepping into his world polished and polite. If he wanted to see me, he'd see me as I was, still smelling faintly of fry oil, my nails short from dishwater, the hem of my jeans frayed from too many washes. He was already seated when I arrived, back straight, hands folded beside an untouched bread plate. No entourage, no assistants hovering, just him, looking older than he had in the diner, more fragile somehow. When he saw me, he stood, not out of formality, but respect. And that small gesture almost undid me. We made awkward small talk, the weather, the city, my classes. He asked about my sociology thesis. Actually listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer unsolicited advice. Then, over seared scallops I barely touched, he slid a thick envelope across the table. A trust fund, he said quietly. Liquid, unrestricted. Enough to finish your degree, pay off your mother's medical debt, buy a home if you'd like. Consider it reparations. The word hung in the air like smoke. I didn't reach for it. Reparations for what? I asked, voice steady despite the tremor in my ribs. For not being at my birth, for not calling on my birthdays, for letting my mother die thinking you didn't care. His face tightened, but he didn't look away. For all of it and more. I pushed the envelope back. Money doesn't fix silence, Mr. Winthrop. It's Alistair, he said softly. And I know it doesn't, but it's a start. That's when his attorney, whom I hadn't noticed seated at the next table, approached. Polite, professional. He placed a manila folder in front of me. Inside, a 6-page DNA report. Buccal swab comparison. Probability of grandparentage, 99.98%. Signed, notarized, processed through a certified lab. I took the test last month, Alistair said, before I even spoke to you. I needed to be certain, not for me, but for you. So you'd know I wasn't chasing a ghost. I stared at the report. The numbers were cold, clinical, undeniable. And yet, they felt like a betrayal of my mother's memory, of my own grief. Because this was how he operated. Facts over feeling, documents over dialogue. He'd rather prove I was his in a lab than earn the right to call me granddaughter in life. I stood up, napkins still folded on my lap. "Thank you for lunch," I said, voice clipped. "But I'm not for sale, and I'm not a case file." I walked out past the hostess, past the diners in silk scarves and cufflinks, past the valet who eyed my scuffed boots with poorly masked disdain. The city air hit me like a slap, real, raw, alive. I didn't cry. I just kept walking, block after block, until my lungs stopped burning. Because here's what I realized in that moment. He thought he was offering a lifeline. But to me, it felt like another transaction, another attempt to buy his way back into a story he'd abandoned. And I wasn't going to let his paperwork erase my pain. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as I boarded the bus home, I also knew this. I couldn't unsee the effort. I couldn't unhear the quiet regret in his voice. And I couldn't ignore the fact that, for the first time in my life, someone with his name was trying clumsily, legally, imperfectly to reach me. And that was harder to walk away from than silence ever was. I didn't go back to him, not right away. But I couldn't stop digging, not out of hope, but out of necessity. If I was going to set boundaries, I needed to know exactly what I was fencing in. So I went to the county clerk's office on my only day off, dressed in my one serious outfit, a navy blazer I'd bought at a consignment store for my college interviews, and asked for public records on Clara Winthrop, née Alastair Winthrop's daughter. The clerk, a woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Marge, didn't ask why. She just pulled a thin file and slid it across the counter. Inside was my mother's original birth certificate, issued in 1975, signed by a physician long retired, and listing Alastair Winthrop as father. No qualifiers, no asterisks, no attempt to erase him, even after everything. My mother had kept his name on her legal identity, even when she refused to speak it aloud. That small act of quiet defiance made my throat tighten. Then I went to Havenbrook First Trust, the bank where, according to the library printout, the minor account had been opened. I brought my ID, my mother's death certificate, and a letter from a legal aid attorney I'd connected with through a community workshop. I didn't ask for money. I asked for verification. The bank manager, a man named Mr. Ellis with silver-rimmed glasses and a voice like worn velvet, met me in a private consultation room. He didn't treat me like an intruder. He treated me like someone who belonged. After confirming my identity and lineage through notarized documents, he pulled a sealed envelope from a vault drawer. "This account," he said, "has been dormant since its creation in 2000. No withdrawals, no contact attempts from the beneficiary until now." He handed me a printed ledger, quarterly statements, annual confirmations, and most telling, a log of inquiries. Every year on June 12, my birthday, Alastair Winthrop, or his authorized representative, had contacted the bank to verify the account's status and confirm that no disbursement requests had been made. Every single year, without fail. Even after my mother's death, when he had no way of knowing if I was alive, he still asked, why didn't he just close it? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Ellis hesitated, then said, "He told us once, if you ever came looking, it was proof you'd chosen to know him. And he wanted you to find it intact, not as a gift, as a promise kept." I sat there, staring at the rows of numbers, and felt something inside me fracture, not break, but shift, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. This wasn't performative. This wasn't a last-minute scramble for redemption. This was a man who'd built a quiet monument to a granddaughter he'd never met, and tended it like a shrine, year after year, in the dark. But I still wasn't ready to step into the light. So I did the only thing that felt true. I called my legal aid attorney, the one who specialized in elder family reconciliation and inheritance ethics, and asked her to accompany me to a meeting with Alistair's legal team. Not to sue, not to accept, but to witness. 2 days later, in a sunlit conference room with walnut paneling and water glasses sweating in the afternoon heat, we sat across from Alistair's lawyer, a sharp woman named Miss Torres, and reviewed everything: the birth certificate, the bank records, the affidavit from Mrs. Delaney, the DNA report, even the diner's employee registry that had led him to me. Miss Torres didn't argue, didn't deflect. She simply said, "Mr. Winthrop wishes to amend his estate documents to formally name Alina Rose Winthrop as co-trustee of the Clara Rose Memorial Fund, pending her consent." My attorney leaned over and whispered, "This is clean. No strings. Full audit rights. You'd have equal say in how it's used." I nodded slowly. Then I asked for one more thing: proof of his annual attempts to contact my mother after their estrangement. Miss Torres produced a sealed envelope from her briefcase, copies of certified letters sent over 15 years, all returned unopened, all stamped with the same forwarding address failure. My mother had moved without updating her legal mail. He hadn't known where to find us. I took the copies, didn't cry, just folded them carefully and placed them in my folder right beside my mother's letter. Because here's what the receipts showed me. He hadn't been perfect. He hadn't been present, but he hadn't been indifferent. And in the ledger of loss that had defined my life, that distinction was the first entry that didn't end in 0. I didn't invite him to a fancy restaurant this time. Didn't meet in a boardroom or a bank. I invited him to my apartment, the one with the window that never quite closed, the radiator that clanked like a metronome all winter, and the thrift store coffee table stained with mug rings from too many late-night study sessions. I wanted him to see the life I'd built without him, not as a guilt trip, but as context, as truth. He arrived precisely at 6 p.m., carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper, no ribbon, no flourish. He wore a simple wool coat this time, no overcoat, no performative grandeur. Just a man, slightly stooped, holding his breath like he was stepping onto sacred ground. I offered tea, my mother's favorite chamomile blend, and we sat on mismatched chairs in the living room, the city's evening hum seeping through the thin walls. For a long while, we said nothing. He looked around, not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet awe, as if seeing the scaffolding of my resilience for the first time. Then I asked the question I'd carried like a stone in my chest. Why now? He didn't reach for excuses, didn't blame time or pride, or even my mother's silence. He just looked at his hands, veined, aged, trembling slightly, and said, "Because I read your mother's obituary, and for the first time in 25 years, I realized I'd been waiting for her to come back to me. Not you, her. I thought if I stayed silent long enough, she'd forgive me and walk through my door. But she never did. And when I saw that she was gone, I understood I'd lost her forever. And if I didn't find you, I'd lose you too." His voice broke on the last word. Just once, just enough. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folio. Not a contract, not a check. A letter handwritten, pages slightly wrinkled, ink smudged in one corner as if touched by tears. "I wrote this years ago," he said. "After I saw your name in the diner listing. I drafted it every night for a week, but I never sent it. I was afraid you'd throw it away. Or worse, read it and think it was enough." He didn't hand it to me, just placed it on the table between us like an offering. I opened it slowly. "To my granddaughter, Alina Rose, though I have no right to call you that yet. I failed your mother. Not because I didn't love her, but because I loved my pride more. I let a man's foolish pride steal my daughter, and in doing so, I stole myself from you before you were even born. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try quietly, patiently, without demands, to earn the right to know you, not as a benefactor, not as a name on a trust, just as a man who finally sees what he threw away and would give anything to hold even a sliver of it again." I read it twice. The second time, my vision blurred, but I didn't look away. Because this raw, unvarnished confession was what all the receipts had been pointing toward. Not proof of blood, but proof of remorse. Not legal validation, but human vulnerability. I thought of the diner's call bell, the one with the chipped red button that needed 2 presses to be heard. All my life, I'd been pressing once, quietly, hoping someone would notice. My mother had pressed once and been ignored. But this man, he'd finally pressed twice. Not with money, not with power, but with words that cost him more than any $500 bill ever could. I didn't say, "I forgive you." I didn't say, "Welcome." But I did something just as powerful. I looked him in the eyes, really looked, and said, "Tell me about her." Before the silence, tell me something only you would know. And for the first time in decades, he smiled soft, sad, and certain. "Clara," he began, voice thick, "used to steal my pocket watch and hide it in the garden, just to see me panic. And just like that, my mother came back to life, not as a ghost of loss, but as a bridge between us." I didn't read his letter in private. I didn't tuck it away like a secret to be processed alone. I chose a room full of witnesses because accountability, real accountability, doesn't happen in shadows. It happens in the light, before people who have seen you at your lowest and still believe you deserve your truth. The Havenbrook Community Center was hosting its monthly Neighbor Night, a potluck fundraiser for the youth mentorship program I'd helped launch. Folding tables lined the gymnasium, covered in mismatched dishes, handwritten name tags, and the kind of warmth that only comes from people who show up for each other without being asked. Mrs. Delaney was there, stirring a pot of her famous lentil soup. Mr. Chen from the library sat near the door, chatting with a group of teens about college apps. Even Lou had come, wearing his apron over a button-down shirt, like he couldn't quite let go of who he was even in celebration. I stood at the mic near the stage, just a borrowed karaoke setup with a slightly crackling speaker, and my hands didn't shake. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I'd made peace with the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't performance. It was proclamation. I've been asked, I began, voice clear and calm, if I'm angry. If I'm using this moment to shame someone, I'm not. But I am using it to make something clear, on record, in front of the people who have held me up when I had nothing. I unfolded Alistair's letter. Not the legal affidavits, not the bank statements. Those had done their work behind closed doors. This was the heart of it, the human part. And then I read it aloud. Every word, the pride, the regret, the plea not for forgiveness, but for a chance. I didn't soften it, didn't edit the parts that stung. And when I finished, the room was utterly still, no clinking forks, no whispered side conversations, just the hum of the overhead lights and the quiet sniffle from someone near the back. Then I added my own words, spoken slowly, deliberately, so there would be no misunderstanding. I accept that he is my grandfather, not because of DNA or deeds, but because he finally chose to show up messy, late, and without guarantees. But I also set terms. I will not be his redemption project. I will not perform gratitude for money. And I will not let his name erase my mother's legacy. I paused, looked out at the faces I knew, the dishwasher who covered my shift when I had exams, the retired teacher who proofread my essays, the single mom who shared her lunch with me on days I forgot to eat. So today, I said, I am publicly claiming my full name, Eleanor Rose Winthrop, not to honor wealth, but to honor truth, and to say, on behalf of every child who's been erased by silence, that we get to decide when, how, and if our stories are reclaimed. Then I turned to the corner where Alistair stood, having slipped in quietly 10 minutes before, standing just inside the gym doors, like he wasn't sure he belonged. He hadn't expected this. His eyes were wet, his jaw tight, but he didn't look away. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who'd seen me scrub floors and study textbooks in the same breath, I didn't just read a letter. I rewrote the narrative, not with vengeance, not with shame, but with clarity, spoken aloud, witnessed, and sealed not by a judge, but by a community that knew exactly how much it cost me to stand there and finally say my name without flinching. The courtroom wasn't grand, just a modest probate chamber with scuffed linoleum and fluorescent lights that buzzed like tired bees. But to me, it felt like sacred ground, because this wasn't about spectacle. It was about settlement, not just of assets, but of absence. Alistair sat beside me, not in front or behind, but shoulder to shoulder, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were no longer on opposite sides. His attorney and my legal aid counsel had spent weeks reconciling every document, tracing every dollar, verifying every claim. And when Judge Marlowe, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing, called our case, she didn't treat it like a family squabble. She treated it like what it was, a legal correction of decades of erasure. Petitioner Alina Rose Winthrop, she said, glancing at me over her glasses. You seek formal recognition as heir and co-trustee of the Winthrop Family Trust, with full authority over the Clara Rose Memorial Fund. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor, I said, voice steady. Not for personal gain, but to steward my mother's legacy as she would have wanted. Alistair didn't speak unless asked. He didn't interject. He simply nodded when the judge looked to him for confirmation, his hands folded in his lap like a student waiting for a grade he knew he might not deserve. Then came the moment that made my breath catch. The judge reviewed the evidence packet, birth certificate, DNA report, bank records, notarized affidavits, even a copy of the letter I'd read at the community center, and said, without hesitation, all documentation is consistent, lawful, and compelling. Petition granted in full. Just like that, it was official. My name was on the trust, not as a beneficiary waiting for scraps, but as a co-trustee with equal voting power on every decision. More than that, the court formally recognized me as Alistair Winthrop's granddaughter in the public record, irrevocable, undeniable, and protected. But the true reversal didn't happen in that courtroom. It came 3 days later at the monthly board meeting of the Winthrop Family Foundation. I walked in not as an outsider, but as a voting member, wearing the same blazer I'd worn to the county clerk's office. The room fell silent. Some board members looked uneasy. One, Alistair's nephew, my uncle, stood and walked out without a word. But 2 elder members, both women in their 70s, who'd known my mother when she was a girl, rose and shook my hand. We've waited a long time for you, one of them said quietly. Then Alistair stood, not to speak over me, but to yield the floor. Before we discuss the annual budget, he said, voice firm despite its tremor, I move to approve the creation of the Clara Rose Community Scholarship Fund, to be administered jointly by Alina and the Foundation's Education Committee. The vote was unanimous. $50,000 a year, renewable, needs blind, prioritizing students from service jobs like mine would bear my mother's name, not as charity, but as continuity, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. As I signed the final paperwork that afternoon, pen gliding over the dotted line, I thought of the diner's call bell, the one that needed 2 presses to be heard. My mother had pressed once, been ignored. I'd pressed again. And this time, the room answered, because lawful justice doesn't roar. It registers, it files, it signs, and then quietly, irrevocably, it changes the future. And for the first time in my life, that future had my name on the deed. There was no dramatic courtroom explosion, no disowning with thunderclaps and slammed doors. The fallout came quietly like water seeping into floorboards, slow but certain. My uncle, Charles, Alastair's only other living son, didn't yell. He just stopped returning calls. When the updated trust documents were sent to all family members, he returned his copy unopened, stamped with a single word in red ink: inadmissible. His wife posted a veiled Instagram story about blood not being enough and opportunities given to those who never earned them. The family group chat, once a place of holiday photos and birthday wishes, went silent, then dissolved entirely. But the real consequence wasn't social. It was structural. At the next foundation board review, Charles moved to block my voting rights, citing lack of familial integration and insufficient knowledge of Winthrop legacy. The motion died 5-2. The 2 dissenting votes were his and a distant cousin who'd never met me. The rest, elders who'd known my mother, who'd watched Alastair grieve in silence for decades, stood firm. One of them, Mrs. Langford, a woman with a spine of steel and pearls to match, said plainly, "Legacy isn't inherited through DNA alone. It's earned through action. And a leaner has done more for this family's name in 6 months than some have in 60 years. Charles didn't attend the next meeting, or the one after that. Eventually, he resigned from the board altogether. Not with fanfare, but with a terse email that read, "I can no longer participate in an institution that prioritizes sentiment over stewardship." Alastair didn't fight him, didn't beg him to stay. He simply accepted the resignation, then redirected Charles's former committee responsibilities to me and Mrs. Langford. There were no lawsuits, no public feuds, just clean, quiet separation, like pruning a branch that refused to bear fruit. Financially, Charles lost access to discretionary family funds tied to board participation. His name was removed from upcoming legacy project announcements. And when the Clara Rose Scholarship launched, his children, once assumed to be shoo-ins for family grants, were held to the same anonymous application process as everyone else. One applied, didn't qualify. That was that. I didn't gloat, didn't post screenshots or whisper to reporters. Because real consequences don't need an audience. They just need to be real. And in the end, what hurt Charles most wasn't the money or the title. It was the irrelevance. For years, He'd assumed the Winthrop name was his inheritance by default. But when the foundation shifted its focus toward community impact, toward the very values my mother lived, he found himself on the outside of a legacy he never bothered to understand. Meanwhile, I kept working. Still took shifts at Lou's on weekends, not because I needed the money now, but because it grounded me. Because the people there never cared about my last name. They cared that I showed up, that I remembered how Keisha liked her coffee, that I covered for Miguel when his kid was sick. One evening, as I wiped down the counter after closing, Lou handed me a steaming mug. "Heard about the scholarship," he said gruffly. "Your mom would have loved that." I nodded, throat tight. She would have funded it herself if she could. He leaned in, voice low. Maybe she did. Maybe she just needed someone to live long enough to carry it. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual chaos. But inside that diner, smelling of bleach and burnt toast and stubborn hope, I finally understood. The greatest punishment for cruelty isn't exile. It's becoming unnecessary to the story you thought you owned. And the sweetest justice, it's building something so true that even silence can't erase it. I didn't offer him forgiveness. I offered him terms. Because grace without boundaries isn't grace, it's surrender. And after everything, I refused to surrender the ground I'd fought so hard to claim. We met on a bench in Whitmore Park, the same place my mother used to take me on Sundays when the laundromat below our apartment got too loud. Autumn had just begun to turn the maples gold, and the air carried that crisp, clean bite that makes you feel like the world is starting over. Alistair arrived early, sitting with his hands folded on his cane, staring at the pond where ducks drifted in quiet formation. I sat beside him, not too close, not too far. "I've thought about it," I said, voice calm but firm. "I'll accept the co-trustee role. I'll help build the scholarship in Mom's name. I'll even have lunch with you once a month if you're here for me, not for a version of me you've imagined." He turned to me, eyes searching. "And if I fail, if I say the wrong thing, offer too much, push too hard, then we pause," I said. "No guilt, no drama, just space. Because this isn't about making up for lost time. It's about building something honest in the time we have left." I laid out my conditions clearly, like clauses in a contract, not to punish, but to protect. First, no financial gifts to me personally, not for rent, not for tuition, not for emergencies. The trust fund exists to serve the community, not to buy my affection. If I need help, I'll ask on my terms, not his assumptions. Second, full transparency on all foundation decisions. No behind closed doors deals. No family preferences. Every dollar bearing my mother's name must pass the same ethical test she would have applied herself. Third, and this was the hardest, he could not speak for me. Not to the press, not at galas, not even to old friends over brandy. If he wanted to tell anyone about me, he'd say only what I'd approved. My story was mine to share, not his to polish. He listened without interrupting, didn't argue, didn't sigh. When I finished, he simply nodded and said, "You're wiser than I was at twice your age." Then he reached into his coat, not for a checkbook, not for a deed, but for a small velvet box. I tensed, bracing for another grand gesture. But inside wasn't jewelry. It was a key. "To the family archives," he said. "Letters, photos, board minutes going back to 1948. Your mother's childhood journals are there. She left them with me before everything fell apart. I never read them. I kept them sealed. They're yours now, on your schedule, in your time." It wasn't a bribe. It was an offering of memory, unfiltered, unclaimed, waiting. I took the key, cold metal against my palm, heavy with history. "Thank you," I said, not for the key, but for respecting that I might not use it right away. He didn't reach for my hand, didn't try to hug me, just stood slowly, steadied himself on his cane, and said, "I'll see you next month, Alina Rose." Same bench, same time. And as he walked away, shoulders slightly hunched, steps measured, I realized something profound. He wasn't trying to fix the past. He was trying to earn the future. And for the first time, I believed he might. Not as a savior, not as a patriarch, but as a man learning, slowly and humbly, how to love without owning. That, I decided, was grace enough. A year later, I walked across the stage in a cap and gown, but beneath it, hidden under the black polyester, I wore the same faded blue apron I'd scrubbed dishes in at Lou's diner. Not as a joke, not as a stunt, but as armor, as acknowledgement. Because this degree, this sociology diploma with honors, wasn't just earned in lecture halls. It was forged in bleach-scented kitchens, on overnight bus rides, in the quiet hours between closing shift and dawn, when I reread my mother's journals to remember why I kept going. After the ceremony, I didn't head to a fancy reception. I went back to the diner. Lou had closed early, strung up fairy lights, and set out a sheet cake that read, "Congrats, Ellie," in wobbly icing. Mrs. Delaney was there, holding a framed photo of my mother in her cap and gown, 1993, community college, the only graduation she ever had. Mr. Chen brought a stack of used sociology textbooks for your future students. Even Keisha, now studying nursing, showed up in scrubs, holding a single white rose, and leaning against the diner's green doorframe, hands in his pockets, was Alistair. He didn't intrude, just stood at the edge of the celebration, watching me laugh with people who'd seen me at my rawest. When our eyes met, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No grand gesture, no spotlight, just presence. Later that evening, in my new apartment, still modest, still mine, I unpacked the last of my college boxes. On my desk, I placed 3 things side by side: my diploma, my mother's repaired gold band, now resized to fit my finger, and the diner's old call bell, its red button still chipped, still stubborn. I ran my thumb over the bell's surface, remembering all the times I'd pressed it, hoping someone would notice I needed help, needed a break, needed to be seen. Back then, it took 2 presses to get a response. Now, I didn't need to press at all. I'd built a life where people showed up without being called. I glanced at the window clean, unclouded, open just a crack to let in the evening breeze. No longer a barrier, no longer a mirror hiding what shouldn't be seen. Just glass, clear, honest, framing a city that still didn't know my name, but didn't need to, because I knew it myself. Alistair had kept his word. Monthly lunches. No unsolicited advice. No envelopes slid across tables. Just conversations, sometimes about the foundation, sometimes about nothing at all. Last week, he'd asked me how to boil an egg. I laughed so hard I nearly choked. He just smiled and said, "Your mother used to say I couldn't cook water." And for the first time, hearing her name didn't bring grief. It brought connection. I looked down at my hands, no longer raw from dishwater, but still bearing faint calluses from years of labor. On my right wrist, I wore the simple watch he'd given me for graduation. Not gold, not flashy, just a quiet timepiece with a leather strap. Engraved on the back, in small script, "For the time we have." The buttons on my blazer, all present, all secure, because I wasn't holding myself together anymore. I was whole, not because he came back, but because I never left myself behind. And in the quiet hum of my apartment, with the scent of chamomile tea rising from the mug on my desk, I finally understood. The greatest inheritance isn't a name or a trust fund. It's the peace that comes when you stop waiting to be chosen and start living as if you already were. If you're watching this, chances are you've stood somewhere in a kitchen, a cubicle, a hospital hallway, a courtroom, feeling like your truth didn't matter because you didn't have the right last name, the right bank account, or the right people in your corner. Maybe you've been told your pain is dramatic, your boundaries are harsh, or your persistence is ungrateful. I've been there too. And I need you to hear this. Your receipts aren't just proof for someone else. They're proof for you. Proof that you showed up, that you documented, that you didn't let silence rewrite your story. This journey wasn't about getting a rich grandfather to acknowledge me. It was about refusing to let anyone, blood or not, define my worth based on their convenience. The legal documents, the bank records, the notarized letters, they weren't weapons. They were anchors. They kept me from drowning in doubt when the emotional tide pulled hard. And if you're in your own quiet battle right now, over inheritance, over respect, over simply being believed, know that you don't need a courtroom to validate your truth, but you do need a paper trail. Save the texts, keep the emails, get things in writing. Find your Mrs. Delaney, your quiet ally who sees you even when the world looks away. In the description below, I've linked vetted resources, a National Elder Ally legal aid network, a guide to tenant and worker rights, and a scholarship database for non-traditional students. Not because I have all the answers, but because no one should have to fight alone in the dark. And if you've walked a path like mine, if you've reclaimed your name, your legacy, or your peace after being erased, drop a droplet in the comments. Not for me, for the person scrolling late at night, wondering if they're the only one holding receipts while everyone else pretends the ledger is empty. Let them see you. Let them know it's possible to win with grace, with boundaries, and without losing your soul. Because this story isn't really about me and Alistair Winthrop. It's about every quiet person who's ever been told they don't belong and chose to build a table anyway. And if you're still watching, if you've made it this far, then you already know the next chapter is yours to write. So go document it, go claim it, and when you do, don't forget to leave the light on for someone else still finding their way home.